Welcome to the Dynamic Leadership Live Series. We're currently in a 6-episode mini-series, and this is episode 3. Today we're going to explore a leadership paradox. Why do capable people who already know what to do, so often fail to use what they know when it matters most? What makes the paradox particularly important for leaders is that the gap between knowing and doing rarely comes from a lack of knowledge. It usually comes from how people actually behave once real pressure, distractions, and competing demands enter the environment. In leadership conversations, we often assume that performance improves primarily by adding knowledge. Executives invest heavily in training, strategy development, and new tools because the underlying assumption is simple. If people know more, they'll perform better. Yet, most experienced leaders recognize a different reality inside their organizations. People frequently know what the right course of action is, but in the moment, they do something else. The gap between knowing and doing is one of the most persistent challenges in organizational performance. Part of the explanation lies in how human behavior actually operates. Much of daily action is driven by automatic patterns rather than deliberate reasoning. When pressure increases, when environments become more complex, or when attention is fragmented by competing demands, individuals rely even more heavily on those automatic patterns. Stress responses narrow attention, organizational norms influence behavior, and familiar routines become the default response. In practical terms, this means that knowledge alone does not guarantee performance. The environment in which people operate and the habits that the environment reinforces, the environment can reinforce those habits, play a major role in determining what people actually do. This is where recent insights from neuroscience become particularly relevant to leadership. Neuroplasticity demonstrates that the brain continually reorganizes itself through repeated experience. The pathways that are used most often become stronger and faster. Over time, behaviors that were once effortful become automatic. When applied intentionally, this principle allows leaders to shape the patterns that drive performance in their organizations. Instead of relying solely on motivation or discipline, leaders can design environments and practices that reinforce the behaviors required for success. The challenge becomes even more significant as organizations grow. Growth increases complexity, introduces new pressures, and requires people to let go of routines that once worked well. Scaling an organization from 50 employees to, say, 200, for example, demands different forms of coordination, decision-making, leadership. Just think about the leadership identity that the senior staff has to go through as that company scales. At the same time, the external landscape is changing faster than ever. Markets shift, technologies evolve, and the pace of information accelerates. Under these conditions, organizations cannot rely on stability alone. They must develop the ability to adapt quickly and recover rapidly when conditions change. And that's also part of this narrative about the brain can change. For executives, this creates a clear responsibility. High performance is not only about setting goals or communicating strategy. It's how people actually behave under pressure, shaping the environment that surrounds them, and building systems that allow the organization to adapt while maintaining clarity and momentum. So there's 3 points I'd like you to keep in mind as we go through this. People often possess the knowledge required for high performance, but pressure, distractions, and habit patterns determine whether that knowledge is actually used. Through neuroplasticity, repeated behaviors become faster and more automatic. Leaders who understand this can shape the habit system that drive performance so that those faster, more reliable habits are not random, but aligned with your vision and the strategies of the organization. And then the third, as organizations grow and environments change, success depends on the ability to adapt quickly and recover from disruption while maintaining strategic direction. I want to just illustrate something to set up the rest of the talk. If you think about somebody who's going to make a change, the new career, new organization, new products, new services, something's different, and you're expecting good things out of it. This becomes a perceived inflection point. That inflection point hits, and we're expecting something like this. But the reality is, once we get there, this might be a blip, and then we end up like this. Meanwhile, there's others that are doing this as well. So what's the difference between this and the person who actually does this, actually takes that trajectory going up? I'll tie it back to neuroplasticity. If you think about comfort zone, and we all know how difficult it is to get out of the comfort zone. You know, you take a look and you'll see that many people do their best work after they've lost everything. I think part of that is because they've lost everything, and there's a lot of things we're hanging on to in our comfort zone that keep us from going up to that next level. And that next level is not just this line. There's a barrier up there. It's an artificial barrier, but it's a barrier nonetheless. And in that barrier, you have habits, limiting beliefs, restrictive beliefs. So some beliefs limit you, but other beliefs just keep you from doing X and force you to kind of do Y. We have stories, bad experiences, and we have good experience. Sometimes you had so much success with something that you don't ever want to do it a different way. I often say the best clients are those who've tried everything because they're ready for what really works and they're ready to let some things go. And I can list more and more, but so what happens is as you attempt to go through this line, you're leaving your comfort zone, right? And you come up here, all of this noise up here knocks you back down. Joe Dispenza calls it crossing the river. And in order to go through it and take that trajectory up, you're going to have to go through the cognitive dissonance that occurs. Now, as this is a leadership conversation, and as a leader looking at your organization, which is made up of people, I would say that this has to do with internal conflict. I'll summarize it all like that. That internal conflict could be habit patterns, and that's what we'll talk about. But there's so many different ways of looking at it, and there's no one size fits all. But once you understand what the habits are that are keeping the person from crossing this imaginary barrier, and it feels real because there's fight or flight that happens when they get into it. When you identify what those habits are, you'll see that they're actually things holding the person back. They're resistance factors, and a lot of those resistance factors have to do with the lack of familiarity with going up there. So in order to have a breakthrough, you have to have a break with the past. That break with the past is scary because it's unfamiliar, and sometimes people just don't like operating under pressure. Some people like operating under pressure, but you give them too much pressure and they collapse as well. So we have to look at this as a set of habit patterns. And yes, we do need to spend some time with the more information, empowerment catalysts, but the more you can remove the internal conflict, the better off you'll be. And we've all experienced, we want to go west, but there's something over there that we don't like. Or we want to go west, but there's something to the east that we really want. You have to choose, and it's okay to choose and decide. The root of the word decide is to cut off from. And once you recognize that making a decision means cutting off some things, but it also opens the door, because once you decide, you're free to put all your focus and emphasis in that one area. So this is sort of the backdrop I want to use as we think about this, is how do we get more people to do this and instead of this, which is to come back in. All right, the knowing-doing gap. Why people don't use what they know. Okay, so the knowing and doing gap. And the way I'm putting this together is to look at the reason why people don't do more of what they know is largely because of habits. And dynamic leadership is aligned with emotional intelligence. In a lot of ways, it's taking the best of emotional intelligence and applying habit neuroplasticity to the emotional intelligence. So emotional intelligence was largely formed before we had the information we do now about neuroplasticity. So applying neuroplasticity to that conversation enables us to move a lot of the action points upstream or earlier in the sequence. And the earlier we move them in the sequence, the more reliable they become and the more influence they have. It's also aligned with self-determination theory. Self-determination theory is all about intrinsic motivation, and those are the three pillars. When you have more of that, you're going to have more intrinsic motivation, autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And this is my model, my view of neuroplasticity. It's completely aligned with how neuroplasticity works. Neuroplasticity focuses on the brain being malleable and what we can do in this step 3 and 4. But because the neuroplasticity works better when we're in states of coherence, and it works better when we're not emotionally charged, I created the 7 steps so that we can modulate our emotions on the way in, so we're in coherence and we have presence before that stimulus comes, because if you're hitting 33,000 stimuli per day, you don't have the luxury and time to reorient on the fly. So we work on being coherent before, and we work on returning to mindfulness very shortly after, because that's about a stimulus response cycle every other second. Now, keeping in line with the content today, to know and not do is not much different than not knowing. This gap can be closed by removing resistance factors, and that's what I was referring to earlier. So those resistance factors, if a person in sports chokes, we don't think that they forgot how to play. We think of it as they didn't handle that pressure well. And behind that is a habit, and it's a habit of creating too much anxiety during moments of high intensity like that. So I'm going to talk about 3 different kinds of habits: reactive habits, behavioral habits, and identity habits. Reactive habits, these are fast stimulus response patterns that fire before conscious thinking. In a lot of ways, reactive habits, while theoretically they're some of the easiest to correct, they become the most difficult because the very fact that they're reactive causes them to trigger when you're just talking or thinking about the topic. If you think of a person in a phobia response, that's what you're seeing. They're reacting, and then they start reacting to their own internal images, their own internal self-talk. They're reacting to their own reactions, which then just takes it off. And that's why logic doesn't work. You start talking to a person who's in that rapid cycling up triggering, there's no logic getting through. You just have to wait for that to run its course because they're reacting internally. Now, you can get their pattern to change. You turn them and look something else, you get their attention, there's a loud noise or something, that might interrupt it, but often they'll just go back. So this is really up to the individual to do. I'm not suggesting we go around interrupting people's patterns, but you can talk about it with them when they're calm and give them ideas about how to modulate that in real time. So these are triggered by perceived threats, urgency, or emotional salience, like we're prominent or maybe focuses on us. And if you think about that external stimulus triggering the reaction, and then the subsequent reactions come from inside, you can see the problem with this. They operate through rapid neural circuits linked to the stress response, narrow cognitive bandwidth, and prioritize speed over reflection. This is why, again, people don't use what they know, because as their bandwidth compresses, they start reacting faster. They just do something to get out of pain, and then you have bad decisions piling on top of other bad decisions. And then difficult to interrupt because they occur early in the reaction sequence. So, I talk about this, the subconscious side and the conscious mind side is about 600 milliseconds where the subconscious is processing, the network of neurons. While that's not language over there, they are sensations. And if you can catch those sensations early enough and interrupt the sensation before it turns into a catastrophization, then you're going to be ahead of the game. Continuous improvement requires nervous system alignment, and that's where the neuroplasticity can help us as well. Change. Behavioral habits. These are reinforced routines built through cue, routine, reward loops. Behavioral habits they're all, the biggest obstacle to habit change is habit itself. When you break through that, you see that there's strategies to breaking these habits, and most of them are better replaced than broken. But when you start thinking about neuroplasticity, every habit is not the same, and that's why I'm talking about this. Behavioral habits are activated by many cues, including environmental, time, emotion, fatigue, and social context. So there are many influences that can trigger that behavioral habit. You may think you have the behavioral habit licked, but you get into a different environment or maybe a certain person, and next thing you know, you're doing it again and you feel like you failed. It's just that there's so many associations. 100 billion neurons connected to thousands of other neurons, so there's trillions of associations, trillions of connections. And if a person's 50 years old, imagine how many times those associations have fired. So there's some depth to it. That's why replacing the habit is often better than trying to replace it, because you crowd out and you literally make that those neural pathways go dormant, and the path of least resistance becomes the one that you're building. Interrupting one trigger often leaves other triggers intact, and that's the point I was making just now. Resistance comes from reinforcement and environmental consistency, meaning every time it fires, you're actually layering in, making it even more the path of least resistance. Behavioral habits persist, not because of weak willpower, but because the loop has many entry points. And that does tax the willpower. So willpower, we know, wanes throughout the day. You get decision fatigue. But then when you have behavioral habits that are persistent like that, it just makes it harder because you're fighting against yourself. And then identity level habits. And these are the constructs. These are patterns that reinforce how a person sees themselves. Confidence, courageous, whatever. Built from repeated behaviors and emotional responses over time. What makes these habits difficult is that they are constructs. People try to change them at the construct level, which you are not going to be successful typically doing that. There are elements that are making them up. Sometimes those elements are reactive habits. Sometimes those elements are behavioral habits. They're reinforced by social expectations and self-perception, often tied to recurring interaction patterns with specific people, and they contain multiple reactive and behavioral habits within them, as I said. Identity habits are difficult to change because they're supported by the networks of smaller habits. So I wouldn't start with identity habits. I wouldn't start with behavioral habits. The first thing I want to do when I'm working with someone is we work on the reactive habits, because the reactive habits are the ones that enable emotional hijacking. Reactive habits are the ones that create this spiraling, this upward spiraling of anxiety, and that causes, again, compressed bandwidth, and it creates this prone to to go into fight or flight. And once it becomes a neurobiological event, once you have the cortisol and adrenaline flowing, you're basically a fraction of your full capability, unless of course you're fighting against a tiger. And personality as a habit structure. So identity emerges from the interaction of reactive and behavioral habits. As you start developing this, your identity will shift, and you'll find it easier to break some of those behavioral habits. As you curtail the reactive habits, you'll find that many of your behavioral habits also go away, because you're not in that constant stressed state. The more coherence we are in, the less these triggers are going to send us into fight or flight. Each identity pattern is supported by multiple underlying habit systems. Two people may share the same visible identity, but rely on different habit structures. And then identity patterns can contain smaller identity patterns within them. So I don't worry about changing identity habits. If somebody says they want to be more confident, or they want to change their personality, maybe what we do is we work on them with speaking in public or speaking live on camera, and make those shifts that way. And that newfound skill will permeate its way through, and their identity will start to shift. But trying to change it at the identity level, all you're doing is triggering other associations that reinforce that same identity. So personality is not a single trait. It's layered. It's a layered structure built from many habits, and that's why I say it's a construct. Why goals drift after launch. So this is what I was talking about with the inflection point. People have all the best intentions, but then when launch comes, then they notice this thing and they notice that thing. Aspirations often fade when real world complexity enters the system. And sometimes we're accustomed to the goalpost moving. We even have that as a plan B. And so we need to stop that, obviously. Execution introduces competing demands and fragmented attention. Cognitive bandwidth shrinks under uncertainty and pressure, and immediate problems crowd out long-standing or long-term aspirations. Without structure, goals become diluted among daily stimuli. So you hear me talk about coherence and mindfulness. It's so important to be clear, knowing that another stimulus is coming within a second or two. It's so important to get back to mindfulness, get back to coherence regularly, and that's the rapid recovery. That's why I say rapid recovery. It makes it look like stability because you're making that rapid recovery at the millisecond level. So ambition is rarely the problem. Environmental complexity shifts attention away from original goals. And then the environmental drag on performance. So I said earlier that the executives, the leadership team is responsible for the environment, for the tone of the environment. And the tone of the environment can create some of these problems that we don't want to, that we don't have, because it creates associations. This is why when you focus on autonomy, competence, and relatedness, you move more towards intrinsic motivation, because by doing those things, you're not triggering the same old associations. People quickly adapt to what others actually do. We know this. Low standards spread through social contagion. This is well-researched content where you introduce a lower standard person into a group. The group's collective standards will often drop. And unfortunately, it doesn't work as fast in the reverse. If you add somebody who has high standards, it doesn't always pull the group up. Low standards spread through social contagion. Stress and ambiguity push people toward easier patterns. Again, what we can do as executives and leaders is to create the environment that has less of that ambiguity, less of that unfamiliarity, less of that stress by orienting people into the right direction. And then descriptive norms override individual motivation. So again, we're talking about the environmental drag on performance. In weak environments, even high performers gradually conform downward. And then what we'll be talking about is performance hygiene. And it all comes back to habits. This is why it's a neuroplasticity conversation. High performance cultures require intentional maintenance, clear expectations and visible standards, reinforcing routines and that protect strategic priorities, environments designed to support focus and regulation, and then development structures that sustain upward capacity. So this finds its way into the development plans, because you don't want to wait until there's a problem to develop the leader to be able to handle it. You want to constantly be developing, and that's that allostasis trajectory curve, that upward trajectory arc, so that you're ahead of the game, especially when you're scaling, because there's always something new. Growing is one thing. Growing and scaling is another thing, because you're adding the leadership team and then adding leaders under that leadership team. So now you have two levels of direct reports. The owner, CEO, senior staff, they're constantly having to adjust and level up as they go through that. And then the knowing, doing gap. Small improvements in habit patterns can unlock far more of what people already know. So rather than focus on giving them more information, what we can do is work on removing some of those resistance factors. Much of daily behavior operates through automatic patterns rather than conscious decision making. Stress, distraction, and environmental cues compress cognitive bandwidth and trigger default responses. So when you hear the term neuroplasticity, don't just think of it as a way to change habits or some obscure scientific term. Understand that everything is so interconnected. As you make small shifts, it's going to lead to better things that you want. And as leaders, we cause some of those triggers. We are walking association maps, right? Because we have so much leverage in an organization. When people see us, they are automatically hyper, because they recognize that we're responsible for their promotion, where the link essentially to whether or not they has security in their position. And so it's hyper, and this that leverage goes both ways. So the same way the organization uses the leader's leverage to build capabilities, it works the other way too, whereas employees put the leader so high, give the leader so much leverage over their lives that small behaviors can create big problems. Reactive habits and behavioral loops often pull people away from intentional action, and then reducing even a small portion of unproductive habits frees capacity for deliberate thinking and execution. So when I talk about development plans over a 2-year period, and I say even experienced people need development plans, this is why. Because it's not just basic development stuff. We're literally teaching people to work the system the way the system was designed. And as people get better in doing it, it becomes automatic, and you'll find your organization shifts. That's why high-performing organizations, they all have so many similarities. Look at Good to Great and Great by Choice. Look at multipliers. These Eighth Habit by Stephen Covey. These similarities have shown up across organizations, and the good news is that neuroplasticity tells us that we can create those habits. We can create the habits in the leadership team, and we can create the habits in the frontline managers, and in doing so, we can shift the behaviors of the front line in an intrinsic way, a self-determination theory way. So this is what I was talking about earlier. We're inside the comfort zone. This is that barrier that you have to cross. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance here because all of these can trigger fight or flight. All of these can trigger associations of discomfort, and it sends us back because we feel like we're not going to make it. The other problem is that anxiety and excitement have the same energy signature, same kind of signature going through the neural pathways, and it's so easy for excitement to be confused as anxiety, and next thing you know, the person is ruminating about how bad things can get and what happened the last time they felt like this, etc. This is where you see people spiral out for no reason. And there is some other issues going on because this is the unknown up here. So people don't like the unknown. The subconscious is fearful of the unknown and the unfamiliar. But what's good about this is you know where you're going, and you use principles in place of your comfort zone patterns. You use known principles, near principles to guide your thinking. You work with your strengths, stay consistent, stay simple, and you can keep this trajectory. It's not going to be a straight line. You're still going to have up and down. This is why we do iterative development. It's why you do some trial and error. And this is why you have development plans, because you have to keep progressing as you move up. Basically saying the same thing. Yeah, so that's it. I'm almost wrapping up. So we're halfway through March, and then we'll be finished with this series. And moving forward into April and May, I'm looking at doing some interactive workshops, interactive working sessions where we do some skunk works, because you can actually you can go from idea to testing in the marketplace easily in 3 days. And we'll demonstrate that doing like 90-minute sessions and building it real time. That's what the plan is for March and for April. So it looks like I'm going to be out for the rest of this week, but I'll tap back in next week, and then we'll continue talking about the executive leaders and executive leadership and managing that pressure curve. All right, we'll see you next time.